The first thing you need to know about Juliana is that she was a connoisseur of quiet. Not the peaceful kind of quiet you find on a mountaintop, but the hollow, metallic sound of a life that's been drained of all true conversation. It was the relentless 24/7 soundtrack of her marriage, and it had become the cage she lived in. Her days were a performance of perfect stillness. Right now, she was in the sunroom, wearing a soft cardigan the color of old rose petals, the kind of color that doesn't demand attention. Her hands, gnarled and wise from 65 years of living, moved with delicate, practiced care over the soil of a wilting fern. The rest of the house was saturated with that quiet. You could hear the faint, high-pitched hum of the refrigerator, a tiny mechanical sigh from the kitchen. Dust motes, suspended in the single afternoon sunbeam that angled through the window, looked like tiny frozen stars, a whole universe of light and movement that was utterly silent. This was her emotional prison. It was luxurious, it was clean, but every polished surface reflected the truth. Juliana was an echo in her own home. She moved through the rooms like a ghost, touching things lightly, never disrupting the perfect order her husband preferred. He wasn't a bad man, he was just elsewhere. Emotionally, spiritually, he had checked out decades ago, leaving behind a perfectly functioning automaton who paid the bills and expected a hot dinner at 7 p.m. But today, there was a different kind of silence in the house, a silence with weight, a silence that felt heavy and, for the first time, not quite lonely. Her grandson, James, was here. James, the beautiful, heartbreaking problem she wasn't allowed to acknowledge. He was 30 years old, built with the easy strength of a man who knows his own purpose, and right now he was stretched out asleep on the worn leather sofa in the den, exhausted from the long drive he'd made just to visit her. His presence was a violation of the house's quiet rules, and yet it was also the only thing keeping her breath from catching in her chest. She crept to the den's doorway, her heart knocking a frantic, unfamiliar rhythm against her ribs. She didn't dare step closer, didn't dare make a sound. She just stood and watched him. He was her grandson, the son of her son, and yet looking at him now, the dark, sweeping curve of his lashes against his skin, the soft, easy rise and fall of his chest, he was simply a man, and a breathtakingly present one. He was the opposite of the emotional emptiness that ruled her life. He was a force of nature, contained for the moment, but you could feel the raw, unfiltered energy humming beneath his skin. This was not a sexual tension, not a scandalous thought, but a far more dangerous one, the intoxicating, forbidden pull of simple, human presence. Standing there, watching him breathe, the silence finally broke, but only inside her own mind. A vivid, painful memory surged up. She saw the girl she used to be, Juliana at 20, with wild, dark hair, wearing a threadbare velvet dress, twirling in a dusty ballroom. She wasn't dancing with anyone, just spinning, feeling the music deep in her bones, dreaming of running away to paint abstracts in a cold, bright studio in Barcelona. She had a favorite song back then, a smoky jazz tune that promised rebellion and passion. That girl, that dream, that raw, vivid creature, she had been suffocated, slowly, kindly, by the demands of respectability and duty. She was buried deep beneath the perfect cardigan and the well-tended fern. But as she watched James, truly watched the deep, almost primal stillness of his sleep, the woman she used to be stirred. The air around him felt warmer, thicker, charged with an intensity that had nothing to do with family and everything to do with the deep, magnetic current of two souls finally seeing each other. She knew, with a certainty that shook her to her core, that the moment he woke up, everything would change. This wasn't just a visit. This was a rendezvous with the part of herself she had mourned for decades. This quiet, melancholy house had its rules, but the beautiful, sleeping man in the next room was about to burn them all down. Before our story truly begins, settle in and let me know in the comments if you've ever felt a silence so loud that it has its own voice. If you enjoy stories that listen to the quiet moments, be sure to subscribe to your channel name. Now, let's go back to the day the quiet was finally broken and Juliana found the courage to breathe again.
He didn't so much wake up as simply appear. One moment, he was a statue of tranquil sleep. The next, his dark, heavy-lashed eyes were open, fixed instantly on her in the doorway. Juliana, caught mid-gaze, froze. The sudden, intense focus of his eyes felt like a spotlight after decades spent in shadow. It was the first time she'd been looked at, not glanced at, not politely acknowledged, but truly seen in what felt like 2 lifetimes. She didn't apologize for watching him. She couldn't. The truth was too big to fit into a polite little excuse. James didn't move, just studied her face, his expression unreadable, yet loaded with a silent question. The stillness was thick and charged, a dense atmosphere only the two of them breathed. Then a slow, gentle smile broke across his lips, the kind that reached his eyes and made them crinkle at the corners. It was the smile of a boy remembering a secret, overlaid with the deep, knowing gravity of a man. "Juliana," he said, and the way he spoke her name, full and clear, without the affectionate cushion of grandma, was a shockwave. It stripped away her 65 years, her titles, her responsibilities. For one breathless second, she was just a woman, standing opposite a man. He pushed himself up, the leather sofa groaning softly beneath his weight, a sound that finally broke the heavy spell. His official reason for being here was plausible enough. He was in town for a conference and had offered to tune up her old piano, which had been silent for 5 years. But she knew, deep in the newly stirring place in her chest, that he was here for something else entirely. He walked over, his movement easy and powerful, and stopped not too close, but close enough for her to feel the displacement of air he created. "Good morning," he said, his voice a low rumble. "You were standing there for a while. Everything okay?" "Perfectly fine," she managed, the answer automatic, the lifetime of polite lies rushing to the surface. She started to retreat, to melt back into the anonymity of the kitchen. But he didn't let her go. His eyes tracked her movement, not with accusation, but with a wary, intelligent focus. "You changed your hair," he observed, his gaze lingering on the delicate silver strands around her temples. It wasn't a question, but a quiet, undeniable statement of fact. She had taken a pair of scissors to the uns just yesterday, a tiny, rebellious snip that Arthur hadn't even registered. "Just a small trim," she mumbled. "It suits you," he countered, stepping closer. "It brings out the light in your eyes." The simple compliment hit her with the force of an insult because it illuminated every year her husband hadn't noticed. It was this meticulous attention to detail, this unhurried focus on her, that was both terrifying and intoxicating. It was the shock of being seen after 2 decades of being an invisible fixture in her own home. The comfort of it was a dangerous, addictive warmth. The forbidden nature of its source, her own blood, her own family, layered the tension into something taut and brittle. They moved to the sunroom where she'd been tending the fern. James didn't talk about the piano. He didn't talk about his job or the conference. Instead, he crouched beside her gardening stool and pointed to the small, leather-bound book she'd bought weeks ago and guarded like a teenage secret. "You're reading Rilke," he noted, his voice low with genuine interest. "I wouldn't have pictured that." "I needed something difficult," she said, the words slipping out before she could temper them with propriety. He picked up the book, his strong fingers careful on the delicate spine. He murmured, flipping through a few pages, "difficulty is the only thing that proves we're still paying attention." He set the book down, but his focus remained fixed on her face, no longer on the trim, but on the deeper landscape of her features. And then he cracked her open. His voice dropped lower, carrying the weight of ancient empathy, and he spoke the line that would become the epicenter of their unspoken narrative. "You look tired, Juliana, but I don't mean sleepy. I mean your spirit looks tired, like you've been holding a great, beautiful wave back from the shore your whole life." The air left her lungs in a sharp, painful rush. That was it. That was the whole, ugly, hidden truth of her existence, articulated not by her own conscience, but by a 30-year-old man who was her grandson, yet felt utterly outside the suffocating confines of her world. He saw the erosion, the slow decay of the spirited girl who once wanted to paint in Barcelona. He saw the prison of performance she inhabited. Tears, hot and immediate, stung the back of her eyes, a physical betrayal she hadn't anticipated. She turned her head sharply, trying to dismiss the tears as a reaction to the dust motes. "Don't," he said, his voice soft, almost a command. He didn't reach for her, didn't move a muscle, but the sheer force of his attention pinned her to the spot. "Don't look away from the truth, not when it finally speaks." The forbidden nature of this exchange slammed into her with a dizzying force. He was her grandson. This level of emotional intimacy was not just wrong, it was destabilizing. But God help her, it was also the first time in decades she felt alive, felt the rough, wonderful friction of being deeply understood. The shock of being seen was giving way to a nascent, terrifying flicker of warmth, and Juliana knew, with a sinking dread and an exhilarating hope, that this was the moment she stopped being a ghost. The quiet had been broken. The silence had finally found a voice. And it was his.
Juliana couldn't speak, not immediately. James's words, "Your spirit looks tired," were a key turning the lock on a vault she'd kept sealed for decades. She sat down abruptly on the nearest chair, a beautiful velvet antique that felt suddenly too small for the weight of her 65 years. The tears dried quickly, replaced by a fierce, almost unbearable ache of recognition. James moved with a stillness that mirrored her shock. He didn't offer a platitude or a tissue. He simply stood, radiating an unwavering focus that compelled her to be honest, not just with him, but with herself. He was demanding a truth she hadn't known she still possessed the strength to articulate. "It wasn't a grand tragedy," she finally began, her voice a dry rasp, tasting of dust and old regrets. "It was 1,000 small, polite concessions." She looked at her hands, the hands that should have been stained with oils and charcoal, but were instead softened by decades of dish soap and dusting polish. "When I was 20, she paused, picturing the girl with the wild hair. "I won a small scholarship. Not much, but enough for a term in Florence to study art history." James leaned against the doorframe, a shadow falling across his face that made him look like a confessor. He never once checked his phone or looked bored. His presence was a rare, precious gift, unhurried, unreserved attention. "I never went," Juliana continued, the word a small, blunt stone falling into the vast quiet of the house. "Arthur was building his practice. He needed me here, to host the right dinners, to maintain the right appearance. It wasn't a fight, it was just understood. Our dream was bigger than my whim. And he was right, on paper. His career blossomed, the house grew. The life we built is objectively, flawlessly beautiful." She swept a hand around the room, the gesture conveying both pride and utter emptiness. "But every time I folded his shirts, I was folding up a little piece of myself. Every dinner party I hosted was a stone placed over the artist I used to be." It wasn't just the physical place that she had given up, it was the personality she had buried. She used to be sharp, irreverent, quick to laugh, and even quicker to argue a point of aesthetics. That Juliana had been too loud, too inconvenient for the life of a corporate wife. She'd replaced her with a silent, agreeable, perfectly manicured host. The slow, quiet erosion, not a thunderbolt,
but the constant drip, drip, drip of duty on a vibrant spirit. As she spoke, the room seemed to shift, the dust motes spinning faster in the beam of light, as if they were finally animated by the velocity of her confession. "I didn't lose my dream," she whispered, looking into James's eyes, realizing this was the real betrayal. "I lost the courage to want it." James pushed off the doorframe and took a step toward her. He didn't interrupt. He simply absorbed her grief, validating the immensity of her loss with the sheer intensity of his focus. His eyes were dark, deep pools of understanding, without a trace of judgment. He wasn't seeing a grandmother complaining about her marriage. He was seeing a woman, a comrade who had survived a spiritual battlefield. "You talk about that girl in Florence like she died, like that part of you is sealed in a time capsule." He took another step, the air around him thrumming with conviction. "But that's not how it works, Juliana. That energy doesn't just dissipate." He stopped directly in front of her. His hands rested on the arms of her velvet chair, framing her face, an intimate gesture that felt both protective and electrifying. She could smell the clean scent of his skin, the faint outdoor tang that clung to his jacket. The physical tension was overwhelming, but it was born entirely of emotional gravity. He leaned in slightly, his eyes boring into hers, demanding belief. "It's not too late to be that person again," he declared, the words like a vow. "She never really left. She's just been waiting. She's the reason you bought the Rilke, the reason you cut your hair. She's the one who woke me up standing in the doorway." His validation wasn't a comfort. It was a powerful, uncomfortable truth. It didn't soothe her pain. It gave her a map to escape it. He was telling her the weight of her past was real, but it was not permanent. He was rooting for her to reclaim her identity, and in that moment, the forbidden connection shifted again. It was no longer just about the shock of being seen, but the dangerous necessity of being believed in. James wasn't just a grandson. He was the accidental catalyst of her late-life revolution. He had given a name to her grief, and now he was demanding she start fighting for the life that was left.
James's hands remained, framing her face, not touching, but holding the gravity of the space between them. His gaze was relentless, not hot, but deep, a still, dark well of expectation. He wasn't letting her off the hook. He was demanding she look at the awakened woman inside. Juliana finally drew a ragged breath, a sound that cut the silence of the sunroom like a saw. "Thank you," she managed, the phrase feeling ridiculously inadequate. She stood, needing to move, to break the potent intimacy of his proximity. "The piano," she murmured, clutching at the plausible reality of his visit. "You came to fix the piano." He smiled slowly, the corners of his mouth turning up in that knowing, gentle way. "The piano can wait. It's been silent for 5 years. Another afternoon won't hurt it. But you," he paused, his eyes sweeping over her, "you've been silent for 40. Let's go for a drive. There's a place I want to show you." She didn't hesitate. The thought of staying in that house, waiting for Arthur's call, waiting for the return of the dead silence, was suddenly unbearable. She grabbed her light shawl, feeling a nervous energy thrumming through her veins that hadn't been there in decades. It felt like an escape, a reckless teenage dash from responsibility. They drove in his car, an anonymous sedan that nonetheless felt like a chariot of temporary freedom. The window was down, and the wind, cool and sharp with the scent of late autumn, whipped through her hair. She let it. She didn't reach up to tidy the silver strands. She simply closed her eyes and felt the rushing air, the first external force she'd surrendered to in years. He took her not to a fancy place, but to the Old Town Reservoir, a sprawling, half-wild park surrounded by towering oaks. This was a place of shared, innocent history. She used to bring him here when he was 7, feeding stale bread to the ducks. But today, it was transformed. The low, golden light of the afternoon sun turned the surface of the water into rippling bronze. They walked side by side along the cracked asphalt path. Their shoulders brushed once, a momentary contact that sent a jolt of awareness through Juliana, sharp and clean. It wasn't desire. It was the intense, magnetic pull of unadulterated companionship. The conversation, once driven by Juliana's confessions, now shifted. It was James's turn to open the vault. He stopped by a mossy stone bench, the same bench where he'd once cried over a scraped knee. "I didn't just come here for the piano, Juliana," he admitted, his eyes fixed on the water. "I came here because I'm about to make a huge change. A promotion. A move. Across the country." The news landed with a quiet, solid thud. It wasn't the nature of the change, but the raw honesty of the confession that held her captive. "They think I'm ready," he continued, shoving his hands deep into his jacket pockets. "They see the confidence, the drive, but they don't see the knot of sheer terror I carry in my gut. They don't see the boy who, when he's alone at 2 a.m., is utterly convinced he's an imposter." He looked at her then, and the confident, powerful man from the sunroom dissolved, revealing a profound and relatable vulnerability. "I keep thinking about my father," he confessed, and the mention of his dad, Juliana's son, added another layer of complexity. He sacrificed everything for money, for status. How he pushed people away because he thought being successful meant being a fortress. "I look at my own life, the late nights, the empty apartment, and I'm terrified that I'm inheriting his kind of isolation, that I'll succeed at work and fail at being a whole person." This was the key. His confession wasn't a bid for sympathy. It was a profound act of mutual trust. Juliana realized their connection wasn't based on his need to rescue her, but on their shared experience of emotional abandonment. He feared becoming the emotionally absent spouse, and she had spent her life married to him. They were two victims of the same lineage of coldness, seeking warmth in each other. They sat down on the stone bench, the silence that followed not hollow, but comfortable, rich with shared understanding. It was a silence that listened. A flock of geese landed on the reservoir, their squawking breaking the quiet. Juliana laughed, a sudden, uninhibited sound, rich and warm, a sound that felt like sunshine breaking through a dense cloud. James's head snapped toward her, and he laughed with her, a deep, joyful rumble that intertwined perfectly with her own. In that moment of shared laughter, the bond deepened irrevocably. It wasn't a forced conversation or an awkward flirtation. It was the perfect synchronization of two spirits finding joy together. The way he looked at her was the sign of their deepening bond. It wasn't the appraising look of a man toward a woman, but the appreciative gaze of one rare, true soul recognizing another. Juliana felt the pull now, a strong, persistent force drawing her to this man, this connection, as a lifeline away from the silent drowning of her home life. The internal conflict, however, returned sharp and clear, like a knife slicing through the warmth. "Is this right?" the voice of 40 years of duty asked. "He is your grandson. This feeling, this intoxicating comfort, this sudden, vital aliveness, isn't this a betrayal?" She looked at James, his head slightly tilted, his expression open and expectant. He hadn't asked her for anything except to see him, and in return, he had seen her. The feeling was pure, honest, and desperately needed. But its source was family, and its recipient was a married woman. The dichotomy was shattering. "I don't deserve this," the dutiful Juliana whispered, the ghost of the old self fighting back. "This freedom, this attention, it's not mine to take." But the new Juliana, the one who wanted to paint in Florence, simply watched him, feeling the profound, terrifying relief of knowing she was finally truly understood. The line between right and wrong had blurred into the golden light of the afternoon, leaving only the urgent, undeniable reality of two hearts finally beating in sync. This shared space, built on vulnerability, was their sanctuary, and it was desperately, dangerously fragile. The sun was a searing orange disk sinking fast behind the oaks of the reservoir park, and with every drop below the horizon, the temperature of Juliana's fragile hope plummeted. They were back in the silent, immaculate house, sitting across from each other at the kitchen island, a small, safe harbor in the vast, cold ocean of the house. The easy camaraderie of the park was gone, replaced by a dense, crystalline tension that James was clearly struggling to maintain. He had fixed her tea, not the usual lukewarm blend she made for herself, but a robust, dark oolong that smelled of earth and smoke. It was one more small, perfect act of service that underscored the terrifying reality. This man saw her, nourished her, and understood the very texture of her loneliness. And he was leaving. James set his mug down with a small clink that echoed too loudly in the evening quiet. He looked at his hands, strong, capable hands that should have been tuning her piano, but were instead delivering her sentence. "I have to go tomorrow morning, Juliana," he said, his voice quiet but absolute. "The conference is over and I need to get back. The actual move preparations start next week." The words landed not as a surprise but as an execution. The fantasy they had built, that shimmering, fragile bubble of shared vulnerability, shattered instantly, leaving jagged edges of regret and loss. He hadn't just announced he was leaving. He had announced the impending end of the emotional sanctuary she had barely had time to inhabit. Juliana gripped her mug, the heat radiating from the ceramic the only real, solid thing she could feel. She nodded, the gesture stiff, practiced, the familiar motion of the dutiful wife accepting inevitable disappointment. The old self, the agreeable, silent Juliana, was trying desperately to reassert control. But James saw the tremor in her hands. He didn't accept the polite nod. "Look at me," he commanded softly, not with dominance, but with a plea for honesty. When she raised her eyes, he didn't offer comfort. He offered the painful truth of his own dread. "It's hard, isn't it?" he admitted, his jaw tight. "It's hard to finally find something real, only to realize it has an expiration date. I shouldn't have come, not like this. I shouldn't have woken you up." His presence, which moments ago had been a life raft, suddenly felt like a chain, binding her to a desire she could not fulfill. He was the only person who had affirmed the validity of her long-buried spirit, and now he was taking that validation with him. His proximity was now a source of immense, stabbing pain. "It's my fault," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I should have kept the distance. I know the rules of this life. You don't ask for things you're not allowed to have." "The rule is a lie," James countered, leaning forward, his eyes blazing with a fierce, quiet passion. "The rule is what kept the light out, and you deserve the light." He paused, his expression twisting with internal conflict. "I feel it too, Juliana. The sense of dread. Like I'm leaving the only real conversation I've had in years." The reality of the betrayal was not in the forbidden affection, but in the crushing inevitability of her return to the numb. The quiet, melancholy house was closing in, the polished wood and soft drapes morphing back into the bars of her cell. She stared past him, seeing the kitchen wall, but witnessing a prophetic vision of her immediate future. The plane taking off, James's number disappearing into the vastness of the new city, the refrigerator humming, the tick-tock of the clock. Her husband, Arthur, returning from his trip, polite and oblivious, asking only about the cleanliness of his study. And her own inner voice, the voice of the tired spirit, whispered with cold, crushing finality. This was just a temporary dream. This was a borrowed moment of clarity. Soon you have to wake up and pay the toll, the full, agonizing cost of knowing what you could have been. The realization forced her to confront the choice. She could retreat back into the comfortable numbness, pull the cardigan tighter and bury the memory of James and the Florence girl under fresh layers of silent duty, or she could stay awake, endure the agony of this new, vibrant pain, and live out the rest of her days tethered to a beautiful regret.
The latter felt like a form of self-inflicted torture. The desperation of being trapped was a physical weight on her chest. She wanted to scream, to run, to smash the porcelain perfection of the quiet house. But the old Juliana had long ago perfected the art of stillness. She simply lowered her gaze to the dark tea, the reflection of the kitchen light trembling on the surface. She was heartbroken, not because James was her grandson, or because of the impossibility of the situation, but because he had gifted her a fleeting, agonizing glimpse of her own true worth, only to have reality snatch it away. She was left on the precipice, facing the return to her old life with the terrible, piercing clarity of the woman she had almost become. The silence was coming back, and this time, she knew exactly how loud it would be.
The final conversation ended not with a resolution, but with a lingering, painful silence. James left the kitchen, his footsteps heavy on the marble floor as he retreated to the den, the temporary sanctuary. He didn't promise to call, he didn't offer a dramatic goodbye. He simply acknowledged the end of the stolen time. Juliana sat alone until the dark outside mirrored the void inside her. But the old routine, the one that demanded she move from room to room securing the house, ensuring the silence was perfect for her husband's return, felt like an ill-fitting costume. The quiet had tried to swallow her whole, but James's words, "She never really left," echoed with the raw, stubborn insistence of a heartbeat. She was awake now, and she realized the true battle wasn't against the silence, or against Arthur's return, or even against the distance James was about to put between them. The fight was against numbness. She rose, not with a sudden burst of energy, but with a quiet, resolute clarity that felt colder, stronger than any passion. She didn't run, she didn't hide. She walked directly to her small, rarely used writing desk in the back study. It was a dark mahogany piece untouched by the life she lived, a relic from the life she planned. She pulled out a sheet of her expensive, creamy stationery, paper reserved only for formal condolences or thank you notes. Tonight, it would be used for the most important correspondence of her life. She took up her pen, not the thin, polite pen she used for grocery lists, but the heavy fountain pen her father had given her decades ago, the one that forced her to write with intention. She didn't write a diary entry, she composed a letter. The pen scratched audibly against the paper in the vast quiet of the house, a rebellious, decisive sound. She began, not to James, but to her younger self. To Juliana, age 20, standing on the dock with one ticket to Florence and a head full of impossible colors. I write this from a point far away from your youth, but terrifyingly close to your fear. I know you were afraid of disappointing them, afraid of being poor, afraid of being alone. I need you to know I took those fears from you. I traded your courage for the comfort of silence. And for that, I am sorry. I sacrificed your fire on the altar of stability. She paused, pressing her fingers to her temples, feeling the ghost of the velvet dress and the wild hair. The grief was still immense, but it was a grief contained now, a memory she was finally allowing herself to own, rather than a wound she desperately tried to conceal. Then she addressed the woman she was becoming, to Juliana, age 65. Standing in the doorway, finally feeling the sun on her face, you are cracked, worn, and scarred. But the spirit you thought you lost is alive and furious. You don't get to run away now, but you do get to stop pretending. You are not defined by the empty chair at your table. You are defined by the courage it took to stand up from it tonight. Your power is not a silver flame of youth. Your power is self-acceptance, the willingness to live with the difficult, uncomfortable, vital truth that was just spoken into your silence. She signed it simply, your only chance. It was a quiet, symbolic act of self-reclamation, a contract with the only person who could save her.
Next, she walked into her bedroom. She didn't turn on the light, letting the faint amber glow from the streetlights filter through the window. She went straight to the full-length mirror, a large, ornate thing that had always felt like a prop in the meticulously staged life she lived. She looked. She didn't see the polite wife. She didn't see the grandmother. She saw the lines carved by decades of suppression around her mouth, the sharp, intelligent glint of her eyes that looked tired, yes, but no longer sleepy. They were awake. She looked at her body not with judgment, but with a clear, sober appraisal of a vessel that had carried her through the silence. She saw the silver strands of hair, no longer a mark of age, but a flag of the new, defiant self who had dared to chop the ends off yesterday. She accepted the age, the loss, and the sudden searing vitality James had ignited. Her final act was the piano. She sat down on the bench in the den where James was sleeping, the old leather creaking a final protest. She didn't try to be quiet. She lifted the lid and her fingers, stiff and unfamiliar, found the keys. She didn't play a masterpiece and she didn't play a sorrowful ballad. She played that smoky jazz tune from her youth, the song that promised rebellion. It was shaky at first. The melody wobbled, the chords were rusty, a few notes flat. But then, as her fingers remembered the rhythm, the tune steadied. It filled the silent house not with the high drama of regret, but with the low, persistent bass line of ownership. The music was imperfect, loud, and utterly hers. It wasn't a silver flame. It was the quietly resolute power of acceptance. She was choosing to carry the pain of the truth rather than the comfort of the lie. She was not going back to being numb. She had finally learned that even if her circumstances, her marriage, her home, her lack of a ticket to Florence didn't change, she had the power to change the silence. She had saved herself right there in the middle of the night on the eve of the great goodbye.
The dawn broke, cold and clear, the morning of James's departure. Juliana did not cling to him. She did not cry at the door. She moved through the morning routine with the quiet, devastating dignity of a queen facing exile. When James kissed her cheek, a gentle, respectful touch, she felt the immense, magnetic pull of him one last time, a current she knew she had to resist for the sake of her own new integrity. "Be the man you want to be," she told him, her voice steady. It was the only blessing she could give him. "I will," he promised, his eyes holding hers in a shared, silent acknowledgement of the seismic shift that had occurred between them. He understood that the real goodbye had already happened the night before, in the music-filled darkness of the den. He drove away, and the house fell back into its deep, habitual quiet. But this time, it was a different quiet. It wasn't the paralyzing silence of a tomb. It was the vast, pregnant silence of a stage waiting for the next act. Days blurred into weeks, and Juliana went about the surface of her life. Arthur returned, polite, focused on his golf game and his portfolio, utterly oblivious. He asked about her week, but didn't wait for the answer. The old routine resumed, flawlessly. She made the coffee, she tended the garden, she hosted the appropriate, quiet dinners. Nothing had changed, except everything had changed. The silence no longer defined her. It was simply the space around her. When the refrigerator hummed, she no longer heard the countdown of her own decay. She heard the echo of the jazz tune she had played on the piano. When she was alone, she didn't just sit. She sat in the study with her fountain pen and slowly, laboriously, continued the letter she had started. She was chronicling the quiet concessions, the moments of buried fire, transforming the raw, aching loss into a historical document of survival.
She was still a wife, still a hostess, still the woman who wore rose-petal cardigans, but under the surface, a shift had occurred. She had chosen to live awake. Living awake meant choosing the sharp, constant pain of knowing what she wanted over the dull, comforting numbness of ignoring it. One crisp, late autumn afternoon, 2 months after James left, Juliana found herself at the old Central train station. She wasn't traveling. She was there to pick up a box of specialized art books she'd ordered, books on the Florentine Renaissance, dense tomes filled with the colors she had once abandoned. This was her new routine, a slow, quiet, defiant reclamation of her intellectual life. The main terminal was a chaos of hurried goodbyes and frantic arrivals. Juliana stood by the ticket barrier, pulling the heavy box of books into her arms, the weight a grounding, physical comfort. She felt the usual wash of anonymity, the comforting knowledge that she was just another woman, invisible in the crowd. And then she saw him. He was standing perhaps 30 yards away, near the departure board, waiting for a train she didn't recognize. James. He looked exactly the same, yet subtly different, sharper, more focused, carrying a sleek leather travel bag that spoke of the successful career he was building. His presence in the chaotic station was a sudden, violent intrusion of the outside world into the carefully managed narrative of her life. Her breath caught, the familiar, powerful current of recognition slamming into her. She didn't drop the books, didn't call his name. She was rooted to the spot, simply watching him. He was looking down on his phone, his handsome profile clean and angular against the institutional clock above him. He looked up, perhaps sensing the intensity of my focus, and his eyes found mine instantly, cutting through the entire bustling terminal. The moment stretched infinite and silent, between the sound of a distant train horn and the announcements crackling over the loudspeaker. No dramatic words were exchanged. They didn't need them. In his eyes, she didn't see pity or regret. She saw the full reflection of their shared secret, the kitchen confession, the park bench vulnerability, the desperate near kiss on the porch. He saw the woman who played the jazz tune into the dark, and he honored her choice. He gave me a small, sad, but profoundly knowing smile. It was the smile of a comrade, acknowledging that the battle for her soul had been fought and won, and that their bond, the forbidden emotional affair, was real and permanent, a secret they would always share, untouchable by distance or duty. Juliana didn't smile back immediately. She simply held his gaze, allowing the pain of the connection to wash over her, a clean, necessary pain that confirmed she was still feeling. Then she gave him a slight, almost imperceptible nod. It was her blessing for his new life, and her vow for her own.